It was a quiet morning in the vast mansion of Victor Langston, a billionaire known for his steel heart and unshakable pride. The golden light of dawn poured through the tall French windows, brushing over the marble floors and grand chandeliers that glimmered above like silent witnesses to a man who had everything, except peace. Victor had built his empire from the ground up, earning wealth that stretched across continents, yet he'd long forgotten the warmth of a simple smile. His world was built on contracts, rules, and trust no one. But on that morning, as he lay on the couch pretending to be asleep, his purpose was not business. It was a test, one designed to expose the truth about a girl too quiet for his liking. Her name was Clara, the new maid. Shy, soft-spoken, and almost invisible within the mansion's busy rhythm, she had something about her that unsettled him. Maybe it was her silence. Maybe it was how she looked at his paralyzed mother with quiet compassion. Or maybe it was how she never once looked him directly in the eye. If you believe in kindness, second chances, and the power of unseen goodness, please take a moment to like, comment, share, and subscribe to Kindness Corner, because today's story will remind you that sometimes, the smallest hearts carry the greatest strength. That day had started like any other. The air smelled faintly of lilies from the vases the maids arranged every morning, and the clock chimed 8 as Clara entered the drawing room. She moved with care, almost afraid to make a sound. Her uniform was neat, though a little worn at the edges, and her hands trembled slightly as she began cleaning the table near where Victor slept. On the polished wood lay a few crisp $100 bills that Victor had intentionally left scattered, bait for temptation. He'd heard rumors, small whispers among staff, that someone had been taking small amounts of money. He didn't know who, but his instincts told him to test the quiet one. He thought she was weak, shy enough to slip a note or two when no one was watching. Clara's eyes landed on the money, and for a moment, her breath caught. Her hands froze mid-air as the soft breeze from the open window brushed against her face. Her reflection shimmered faintly in the polished surface, and for a heartbeat, Victor could almost feel her thoughts racing. He kept his breathing steady, pretending to sleep, curious to see what she'd do. But what happened next made his chest tighten in ways he didn't expect. Clara slowly gathered the bills, not to pocket them, but to straighten them carefully and place them neatly in the center of the table. Then she did something that shattered the cold walls of Victor's heart. She pulled out a small, crumpled envelope from her apron pocket. It was sealed, old, and worn around the edges. She hesitated before placing it beside the money. Her hand lingered over it, trembling slightly, before she whispered under her breath words too soft for Victor to catch. Then she stepped back, her eyes glistening, and quietly resumed dusting the nearby shelf. Victor waited until she left the room before sitting up and reaching for the envelope. It was addressed to him, handwritten, simple, for Mr. Langston. Inside were two things, a small folded note and a faded photograph. The note read, "Sir, I found this money yesterday under the couch while cleaning, but I didn't know who it belonged to. I didn't want to assume. I'm leaving it here so it can be returned properly. Thank you for giving me work. It means more than you know. Clara." The photograph was of a young girl, maybe 10 years old, in a hospital bed holding a teddy bear. On the back, in the same neat handwriting, were the words, "My little sister, Anna. I'm saving for her treatment." For the first time in years, Victor felt something break inside him. The weight of his own distrust pressed hard against his chest. He had tested this girl, humiliated her silently, expecting greed, and instead found grace. He leaned back in the chair, staring at the picture, remembering how his own sister had once suffered when he was too busy chasing profits to be there. The memory he'd buried for years now clawed its way back into the open. Over the next few days, Victor watched Clara quietly. She always arrived early, left late, and worked with a devotion that wasn't for show. She'd often stop by his mother's room, adjusting her blanket or reading softly from an old book. His mother, once expressionless and detached, had begun smiling again because of that girl's gentle presence. And still, Clara never once mentioned her sister or her struggle. She simply worked, grateful for the little she had. One evening, when the rain poured outside and thunder rolled through the hills, Victor found himself pacing the halls, unable to sleep. He stopped outside the kitchen and saw Clara sitting alone at the table, eating a piece of bread with tea. The way she looked at the lightning, half frightened, half awed, reminded him of the days he'd watched storms as a child, back when life was simpler. Something about her purity made him realize how lost he'd become. The next morning, Victor called his accountant and quietly arranged a donation under Clara's name to a hospital specializing in pediatric care. He didn't sign his own name on the form. He wanted her to believe it was a miracle, not charity. But when the hospital called her that evening with the news that her sister's treatment was fully funded, Clara broke down crying in the hallway. Victor watched from the doorway, hidden in the shadows, feeling something in him heal as her sobs filled the air, not of sadness, but relief. The next day, Clara came to work with tear-swollen eyes but a brighter smile than he'd ever seen. She worked with a lightness that filled every corner of the mansion, humming softly as she moved. Victor couldn't help it, he had to tell her the truth. When he finally did, when he confessed that it was him, that he had pretended to sleep to test her honesty and had been the one to pay for her sister's care, Clara didn't say a word. She simply looked at him, her eyes shining with tears, and whispered a quiet thank you that carried more sincerity than any words of praise he'd ever heard in his boardrooms. In that moment, Victor realized that kindness wasn't weakness, it was the strength to stay pure in a world that rewarded greed. He learned that trust could be born not from power, but from humility. From that day on, the mansion changed. The flowers seemed brighter, his mother laughed again, and the air carried a warmth that had long been missing. Clara stayed on, not as a maid, but as a part of something bigger, an unspoken reminder of humanity's quiet power. The morning sun glimmered across the vast iron gates of the Marlowe estate, painting the golden details with an almost heavenly glow. Yet inside those gates, what unfolded was anything but heavenly. A woman in an elegant emerald dress stood tall, her face twisted with disdain, as she tilted a heavy bucket of dirty water over an older woman and a little girl. The liquid cascaded down, staining their clothes, splattering across the ground, while the child clung in fear to her grandmother. The sound of the gates creaking open masked the roar of a black luxury car pulling in, and from it stepped Alexander Marlowe, the billionaire heir everyone admired but few truly knew. He froze in disbelief, his eyes locked on the cruel act before him, and his world shifted in an instant. If you believe kindness and second chances are what make this world brighter, then please pause for a moment to like, comment, share, and subscribe to Kindness Corner, where stories of humanity come alive. Alexander had always been a man of precision, living by schedules, business meetings, and boardroom decisions. But on that day, he had decided to come home unannounced, eager to surprise his mother Eleanor and his 7-year-old daughter, Sophie, after weeks of relentless travel. He had dreamed of spending a day with them, laughing in the garden, perhaps even planning the upcoming wedding with his fiancée, Isabella. He never imagined his homecoming would instead unravel the darkest truth about the woman he intended to marry. Eleanor was a graceful woman in her 60s, a widow who had raised Alexander alone after his father's passing. Her strength, dignity, and quiet resilience had shaped him into the man he was today. Sophie, his precious daughter, had lost her mother when she was just 2 years old, and since then, Eleanor had stepped into both roles, showering the child with unending love. For Alexander, his mother and daughter were not just family, they were his anchor, his heart, his very reason to keep moving through the ruthless storms of business and power. Isabella, on the other hand, came from a world of grandeur and ambition. She was stunning, eloquent, and always immaculately dressed. To outsiders, she appeared the perfect match for a billionaire, a woman of beauty and status who could carry the Marlowe name with elegance. Yet beneath her polished exterior was a coldness that Eleanor had quietly sensed, though she never voiced her concerns to her son. She endured Isabella's subtle insults, the dismissive looks, the way she treated the household staff, all because she didn't want to plant doubt in Alexander's heart. What Eleanor never expected was that this woman's cruelty would one day spill over onto Sophie, her innocent granddaughter. That morning, while Alexander was still on his way back, Eleanor and Sophie had been playing near the grand fountain. Sophie had been picking wildflowers, her laughter echoing in the courtyard, when Isabella arrived in her gleaming gown, clearly agitated by their presence. She scolded Eleanor for letting Sophie run around and for spoiling the image of the estate. Eleanor, with her soft patience, merely apologized and tried to gather Sophie away. But Isabella, filled with contempt, decided an apology was not enough. She retrieved a bucket of dirty water, meant for cleaning, and without hesitation, poured it over them. The water hit with a cruel splash. Sophie screamed in fear, her tiny arms wrapping tightly around her grandmother, while Eleanor, soaked and trembling, tried to shield her with her frail body. Isabella smirked, her eyes glinting with a twisted satisfaction. "This is what you deserve," she whispered to herself, convinced no one of importance would ever know. But Alexander had seen everything. His breath caught, his fists clenched, and his heart felt as if it had been stabbed. For a moment, he was too shocked to move, unable to comprehend how the woman he thought he loved could be capable of such cruelty. He had adored Isabella, defended her, even envisioned a future where she became a mother figure for Sophie. And now, in the blink of an eye, those dreams shattered like fragile glass. Slowly, he walked forward, his shoes echoing against the stone driveway. Isabella turned, startled, and the color drained from her face when she realized he was standing there. He said nothing at first, his silence louder than any words. His eyes burned with disappointment, betrayal, and an anger so deep it made Isabella tremble. She stuttered excuses, trying to twist the moment, blaming Eleanor for being clumsy, blaming Sophie for misbehaving, but Alexander saw through every lie. He knelt down beside his mother and daughter, his expensive suit soaking as he wrapped them in his arms. Sophie sobbed into his chest, whispering that she was scared, while Eleanor, her voice calm but breaking, told him not to worry about her. But Alexander knew better. This moment wasn't about spilled water. It was about dignity, love, and respect, things Isabella had trampled without remorse. The engagement ended that very day. Alexander didn't raise his voice, didn't argue, he simply looked Isabella in the eye and told her to leave. Her protests, her tears, her desperate pleas to reconsider meant nothing. Because in that courtyard, under the golden gates and the wide-open sky, Alexander realized that no amount of wealth, beauty, or status could ever replace the simple truth of kindness. News of the broken engagement spread quickly through society, with whispers and speculation filling gossip columns. But Alexander didn't care. He spent the following days focusing entirely on Eleanor and Sophie. He planned little surprises for Sophie, from picnics in the garden to bedtime stories he had missed telling. He sat with his mother over tea, listening to her wisdom, cherishing the quiet moments they shared. Slowly, the shadows of that awful morning began to fade, replaced by the warmth of their love. What Alexander learned was that true love was not found in someone's charm or outward perfection, but in how they treated the people who could do nothing for them. Isabella had failed that test, but Eleanor and Sophie had reminded him that life's real treasures were the bonds of family, the power of compassion, and the courage to walk away from toxicity. The morning sun poured through the tall glass windows of St. Mary's Hospital, but inside the waiting area, the air felt heavy with despair. Among the weary faces and hurried footsteps, one voice rose above the rest, broken, trembling, and desperate. A young mother, clothes torn at the seams and a teddy bear dangling from her arm, clutched her sick child close to her chest. Her knees buckled as she fell near the reception counter, crying out, "Please, someone, please save my daughter." It wasn't just a cry for help, it was a scream of a soul breaking under the weight of helplessness. People turned to look, some with pity, others with indifference, but none stepped forward. She was invisible to most, just another struggling soul in a world moving too fast to care. But in that moment, fate placed someone in the hallway who was never supposed to be there, a man whose life was filled with riches, power, and privilege. A man whose decisions moved markets and built empires. His name was Adrian Cross, one of the wealthiest men in the country. And what he witnessed that morning would change him forever. If you believe in kindness, compassion, and second chances, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Kindness Corner. Comment below to tell us why stories of hope matter to you. Adrian had only come to the hospital for a quick board meeting about a new medical wing his foundation was funding. He had no intention of stopping in the waiting area. His life was a carefully managed schedule of luxury cars, private jets, and appointments that never waited. But as he passed the counter, he froze. His sharp eyes landed on the woman kneeling on the cold floor, holding a fragile little girl whose cheeks were pale and whose small chest rose and fell with shallow breaths. The mother's name was Marissa Lane. Life had not been kind to her. Once a bright student with dreams of becoming a teacher, she had been abandoned by her partner when their baby girl, Sophie, was only a few months old. Since then, she worked 3 cleaning jobs, often skipping meals so her daughter could eat. Poverty clung to her not just in her torn jacket and worn shoes, but in the way her shoulders slumped with exhaustion. Yet her eyes told a different story, they burned with fierce love, the kind only a mother fighting for her child could carry. For weeks, Sophie had been ill. A fever that would not break, weakness that left her unable to stand, and a cough that grew worse by the day. Doctors had confirmed she needed an urgent, expensive treatment. Without it, her chances were slim. Marissa had begged every charity, knocked on every door, but all she collected were sympathetic smiles and whispered apologies. And now, at the hospital desk, she was being told once again, "We can't start the treatment without the payment." Her cries echoed through the sterile hallway. "Please, she's just a child. Take me instead if you must, but don't let her die. I'll do anything." Her voice cracked as Sophie whimpered faintly in her arms. Adrian felt something stir inside him, a feeling he hadn't allowed in years. His empire was built on hard contracts, tough negotiations, and an unshakable belief that every man and woman controlled their own destiny. But as he looked at Marissa and her fragile daughter, he saw a truth he had ignored: sometimes people didn't fail because of laziness or weakness. Sometimes life simply crushed them under burdens too heavy to carry. He could have walked away. He could have told himself it wasn't his problem. But instead, he found his steps moving toward her. When Marissa lifted her tear-streaked face and her desperate eyes met his, she didn't see a billionaire. She saw another human being who might still have a heart. Adrian spoke quietly to the nurse, and in moments the resistance faded. "Prepare the child for immediate treatment. All expenses will be covered under my account," he said firmly. The nurse, stunned, nodded and rushed to comply. Marissa gasped, clutching Sophie closer as if afraid the promise would vanish. "Why?" she whispered through her sobs. "Why would you do this for us?" Adrian didn't answer immediately. His gaze fell on Sophie's tiny hand wrapped around the teddy bear, the symbol of innocence she clung to even in sickness. Finally, he said, "Because no child should pay the price for what the world failed to give. And no mother should beg for mercy that should already be hers." As the hours passed, Sophie was admitted, and doctors began the life-saving procedure. Marissa waited outside the room, trembling with a mixture of fear and hope. Adrian stayed, too, his expensive suit and polished shoes out of place among the worn plastic chairs of the waiting area. He sat beside her in silence, his presence a strange comfort. Memories haunted Adrian as he waited. Long ago, he had grown up in poverty himself. His own mother had faced countless nights of hunger just to keep him alive. He had buried those memories under layers of wealth and success, never allowing himself to feel that pain again. But Marissa's voice had torn down those walls, reminding him of where he came from, and of a love he once knew, the love of a mother who gave everything. Hours later, the doctors returned with news: Sophie's condition had stabilized. The treatment was working. Relief flooded Marissa's face, and she collapsed into tears, this time of gratitude. She turned to Adrian, unable to find words strong enough to thank him. But Adrian wasn't finished. He learned about Marissa's struggles, how she juggled jobs, how rent consumed her small income, how every day was a battle just to provide her daughter a chance to live. His heart, hardened by years of business battles, softened in the face of her resilience. Quietly, he made a decision. He arranged for Marissa to receive steady financial support, not as charity, but as a job within his foundation. He promised her flexible hours, enough to provide for Sophie without sacrificing her health. He also set up an education trust fund for Sophie, ensuring she would never be denied opportunities because of poverty. Marissa, overwhelmed, shook her head in disbelief. "You don't even know us. Why go this far?" Adrian finally allowed himself a small smile. "Because once, someone gave my mother and me a chance. And it changed everything. I think it's time I return that gift." The story of Adrian Cross and Marissa Lane spread quietly at first, whispered among hospital staff, then carried by those who had witnessed the scene. In a world often clouded by greed and indifference, one act of kindness had ignited hope. A billionaire, once untouchable, had chosen to bend down and lift someone who had fallen. And that choice had not only saved a little girl's life but had also rewritten the future for an entire family. As the sun set that evening, Marissa held Sophie close, her daughter's tiny breath stronger now, her color returning. For the first time in years, Marissa felt something she thought she had lost forever: safety, hope, and the belief that the world had watched billionaires do remarkable things, build skyscrapers that touched clouds, buy islands no one could pronounce, and chase the moon for profit. But no amount of wealth, no power, and no fame could mend the soundless world of little Clara Whitmore, the only daughter of business magnate Adrian Whitmore, a man whose name was synonymous with fortune. Born into a life where gold was ordinary and silence was her constant companion, Clara hadn't spoken a single word since the day she came into this world. Her laughter never echoed in the marble halls of the Whitmore mansion. Her father had all the world could offer, except the one thing his daughter's heart could not give, her voice. If you believe that kindness and second chances still matter in this world, please take a moment to like, comment, share, and subscribe to Kindness Corner, because what you're about to hear isn't a story about money, but about a miracle that only compassion could buy. For 7 years, Adrian turned his pain into obsession. He built a private wing in the city's largest hospital. 100 of the finest doctors, neurologists, psychologists, and speech therapists from every corner of the world were flown in. They studied Clara's silence through machines, tests, and theories that filled shelves thicker than any library. Each one left with sympathy in their eyes and defeat in their hearts. There's nothing wrong with her vocal cords, they said. It's psychological. Maybe she chooses not to speak. Those words cut deeper than any diagnosis. Because how could a father accept that his child chose silence when she was only a baby? Adrian's mansion became a temple of sorrow. Every corner echoed with Clara's quiet presence, her small hands tracing the walls, her drawings of colorful butterflies stuck to windows, her smile that never reached her voice. Every morning he'd sit by her bed, holding a book, reading stories aloud to a daughter who never replied. Once upon a time, he'd whisper, there was a princess who couldn't speak. And every night, he'd leave her room feeling smaller than the man the world thought he was. One cold morning, as the hospital prepared for yet another round of experimental therapy, the unthinkable happened. The hospital janitor had resigned unexpectedly, leaving behind a mess in the West Wing. The management, desperate for help, hired a replacement from the city's maintenance services, a quiet man named Eli Navarro, who wore a faded orange uniform and carried an old mop that had seen better days. He was assigned to the pediatric section, scrubbing floors, changing bins, and humming softly as he worked. He had no medical degrees, no titles, and no prestige. Yet there was something about him, a calmness that wrapped the air around him in gentleness. Eli noticed Clara the first day he entered her room. She sat by the window, her small figure glowing in the morning light, her sketchbook open, her eyes wandering through the clouds. He paused, quietly took off his cap, and smiled. She didn't look at him, but something in her posture shifted, as if she sensed a presence that wasn't there to diagnose her, but simply see her. He resumed his work silently, humming an old tune that had no name but carried warmth. When he left, he found a small drawing on his mop cart, a picture of a man holding a broom beside a smiling sun. Days turned into weeks, and Eli became part of the background. But Clara began to notice him, the way he always looked at things others ignored. A drooping plant, a flickering light, a fallen crayon, he fixed everything with quiet care. He never spoke much, but he listened deeply. And for a child who lived in a world where everyone spoke at her instead of to her, that was enough. One morning, Adrian entered Clara's room to find her smiling wider than he'd seen in years. Eli was crouched beside her bed, arranging colorful soap bubbles in a bucket. He gently dipped the mop handle, lifted it, and blew through the hole he'd carved in its stick, and suddenly, the room filled with shimmering bubbles dancing in the sunlight. Clara giggled, a soundless giggle, but her joy lit up the room. Adrian stood frozen at the door, torn between confusion and awe. From that day, Eli would visit Clara's room after finishing his shift. He'd draw with her, build small origami animals from the paper wrappers of cleaning supplies, and tell stories with gestures and expressions instead of words. He never asked why she couldn't speak. He never treated her as broken. He treated her as whole, and that made all the difference. One afternoon, Clara was drawing a picture of a bird in a cage. Eli watched quietly. When she finished, he picked up a small feather he had found earlier in the garden, placed it in her hand, and gently opened the paper cage she'd drawn. Then he whispered the first words she'd ever seen from him, written in shaky letters on the drawing, "It's okay to fly." Something shifted inside her. The next morning, Adrian received a call from the hospital nurse. Clara had been found awake before dawn, staring at the window, whispering something faintly. He ran faster than he ever had in his life. When he reached her room, he saw Eli sitting beside her bed, his eyes wide with tears, as Clara repeated the same word again and again, her voice trembling but real. "Fly, fly." Adrian collapsed beside her, sobbing like a man who had just been reborn. For years, he had believed only science could save her. But it wasn't science, it was love, patience, and the unspoken power of being seen. Clara began therapy again, this time not surrounded by doctors in white coats, but by a man in an orange uniform who believed she already had everything she needed inside her. Months later, she was speaking in full sentences, her laughter echoing through hospital halls that had long forgotten joy. The doctors who once shook their heads in defeat now applauded in disbelief. Adrian personally invited Eli to his mansion, offering him anything, money, a house, a lifetime of comfort. But Eli simply smiled and said, "Sir, I'm just glad she found her voice. That's worth more than I'll ever earn." Adrian, for the first time, realized the depth of true wealth. It wasn't in numbers or net worth, it was in the quiet miracles born from kindness. He established a foundation in Eli's name, funding programs for children with speech and emotional disorders, all built on one philosophy: sometimes healing begins not in medicine, but in connection. The airplane cabin was calm at 35,000 feet, the kind of calm where people sink into novels, headphones, and soft blankets. But that calm shattered in seconds when Evelyn Moretti, the elegant wife of a billionaire, suddenly slumped forward in her seat. Her necklace glimmered faintly in the cabin light as her eyes closed and her head tilted lifelessly. Gasps erupted, a businessman cried out for help, and the air turned thick with panic. It was a moment where time seemed to freeze, where every heartbeat sounded like thunder, and where no one seemed to know what to do. If you believe in kindness, second chances, and the power of ordinary people to change lives in extraordinary ways, take a second now to like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to Kindness Corner, because stories like this remind us that miracles often come from the most unexpected places. Evelyn Moretti wasn't just another passenger. She was the wife of Adrian Moretti, one of the most influential billionaires in the world, seated just a row behind her. Adrian's hands clutched his head in horror as he shouted for a doctor, his voice trembling in a way no one had ever seen from the man known for his ruthless composure in boardrooms. Flight attendants rushed forward, but their training manuals seemed to blur under the pressure of the moment. They searched for medical help among the passengers, but no one responded. People whispered, some shrank back, terrified. In the midst of this chaos, a boy in a blue janitor's uniform, seated awkwardly near the back of the cabin, stood up. His name was Marcus Hale, a 17-year-old working part-time as a janitor at the airport. He wasn't supposed to be on this flight. A scheduling error had accidentally upgraded him to a standby passenger after his shift cleaning the very plane he now sat on. He had been heading home to visit his sick mother in a small town, his ticket a gift from a sympathetic supervisor. He had no wealth, no influence, and certainly no medical degree. Yet something inside him refused to let him stay seated while a life was slipping away in front of him. Marcus pushed through the narrow aisle, his heart pounding like drums in his ears. People stared, some muttered, others shook their heads. Who was this boy to think he could help? But Marcus had seen things others hadn't. His mother had lived with a heart condition for years, and he had spent countless nights by her side when she collapsed, learning from paramedics and local nurses what to do in moments of crisis. He wasn't a doctor, but he had something almost as powerful: courage, instinct, and a will to try. He knelt beside Evelyn, noticing her shallow breathing and the pallor on her face. The flight attendant stepped back, unsure whether to intervene, but Adrian's desperate eyes met Marcus's, silently begging him to do something. The boy placed his hands over Evelyn's chest and began chest compressions, steady and focused, just as he had practiced on training dummies in free community classes. Every push was a prayer. Every breath he gave her a silent promise that she would not be left alone. The cabin went silent except for the rhythmic sound of his effort, the beeping of the oxygen machine being prepared, and the muffled sobs of Adrian behind him. Minutes felt like hours. Some passengers whispered that it was hopeless, others closed their eyes in silent prayer. But Marcus never faltered. Sweat poured down his forehead, his arms ached, but he pressed on, his youthful determination shining brighter than any diamond Evelyn wore. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Evelyn gasped, a shallow, fragile breath, but a breath nonetheless. Her chest rose weakly, and her eyes fluttered open just enough to signal life. A collective gasp swept the cabin, and then relief spread like wildfire. Adrian Moretti, the man who owned skyscrapers and empires, collapsed into tears as he leaned forward to grip his wife's trembling hand. Flight attendants quickly secured oxygen masks, passengers erupted in applause, and Marcus sat back against the aisle wall, exhausted, tears stinging his eyes not from weakness, but from the overwhelming realization of what had just happened. But what moved people the most wasn't just that Evelyn survived. It was who had saved her. The contrast was staggering. The billionaire's wife, draped in wealth and prestige, had her life pulled back from the edge not by a doctor, not by another billionaire, but by a teenage janitor in a cheap uniform who had been invisible to most of the world just hours ago. It was a moment that stripped away the illusions of class and status, revealing the raw truth that compassion knows no boundaries. As the flight prepared for an emergency landing, Adrian sat beside Marcus. For the first time, the billionaire saw not just a boy, but a hero. Adrian's gratitude was wordless, his teary nod and trembling hand on Marcus's shoulder spoke louder than anything. In those quiet minutes before landing, Marcus thought of his mother, of the nights she had told him he was stronger than he believed, and he felt for the first time that her words were true. When the plane landed, paramedics rushed Evelyn to a hospital where she stabilized further. News of the event spread quickly. Headlines exploded: teenage janitor saves billionaire's wife at 35,000 feet. Interviews flooded in, reporters hounded Marcus, but through it all, he remained humble. He didn't see himself as a hero, he had only done what his heart told him to do. Adrian, however, would never forget. The man who had once believed money could solve anything learned that sometimes, salvation comes from the unlikeliest of places. In the weeks that followed, he visited Marcus and his mother, offering not just financial help but genuine friendship. Evelyn, still weak but recovering, held Marcus's hand during a press conference and called him her guardian angel in disguise. The story of Marcus Hale became more than news. It became a symbol of humanity's quiet strength, a reminder that heroes don't always wear uniforms of authority, sometimes they wear the plain clothes of those society overlooks. On that ordinary flight, in that extraordinary moment, a boy no one expected rose to save a life, and in doing so, saved much more than that. He saved hope, faith, and the belief that kindness, in its purest form, can change everything. It was a quiet afternoon at the elegant Aurelia Hotel, the kind of place where polished marble floors whispered wealth, and chandeliers reflected lives untouched by struggle. Yet, amid the hum of expensive conversations and clinking glasses, stood a shy young waitress named Nora Vellin, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted her apron. She had been working here for barely 2 weeks, invisible among the refined guests who never looked twice at those who served them. But that day, a single moment, a single gesture, would change her life forever, and leave even the coldest hearts in tears. If you believe in kindness, compassion, and second chances, then please take a moment to like, comment, share, and subscribe to Kindness Corner, because stories like this one remind us that even the smallest acts can speak louder than words. Nora had always lived quietly. Life had not given her the luxury of noise or confidence. She grew up in a small, struggling household where silence was her shield. Her father left when she was 12, her mother worked double shifts to keep the lights on, and Nora often spent her evenings practicing sign language, a skill she had learned to connect with her younger brother, Eli, who was born deaf. That skill, born of love, sacrifice, and necessity, had always been her secret comfort, a silent world where words could never wound. The Aurelia Hotel was the farthest thing from her world. It was where billionaires, diplomats, and polished heirs came to dine beneath golden ceilings. And that afternoon, Nora was assigned to serve at Table 9, a private setting reserved for billionaire Adrian Cole and his mother, Margaret Cole, a woman of grace, dressed in pearls and quiet dignity. Adrian was known for his brilliance in business, but also for his reputation as cold, precise, and distant. Most of the staff whispered about him, a man who built an empire yet seemed untouched by humanity. When Nora approached their table, her palms damp with nerves, she noticed something that made her pause. Margaret Cole wasn't responding to the waiter's questions. Instead, she smiled softly, trying to read lips. Then Nora saw it, a discreet hearing aid and the way Adrian gently leaned closer to his mother when speaking. Nora's heart clenched. She recognized the effort, the familiar rhythm of someone living between two worlds, one filled with sound and one embraced by silence. Adrian glanced up impatiently, noticing the hesitation in Nora's stance. He expected formality, efficiency, not empathy. But before he could speak, Nora took a small, steadying breath. Then, with trembling hands, she began to sign. Her fingers moved gracefully, expressing what her lips could not. Would you like still or sparkling water? For a heartbeat, everything around them froze. Margaret's eyes widened in disbelief, her hand flying to her chest as if those silent gestures had reached deeper than any word could. Then tears welled in her eyes, tears of recognition, of gratitude, of joy. She signed back slowly, "You know sign language?" Nora nodded, smiling softly, her heart racing. Adrian stared in stunned silence. For years, he had seen the world treat his mother with polite pity or awkward impatience. Waiters avoided her, conversations excluded her, and every dinner outing was a careful balancing act to protect her from embarrassment. But now, across the linen table, his mother was laughing, truly laughing, as her hands moved in perfect rhythm with a stranger's. As the lunch went on, something magical unfolded. Nora didn't just serve, she connected. She signed each question, each menu option, and even shared small, light-hearted signs that made Margaret's eyes sparkle like they hadn't in years. Other guests began to notice, the billionaire's mother chatting joyfully with the shy waitress, and whispers spread through the dining hall. Adrian didn't care. For once, he wasn't thinking about profits or deadlines, he was watching his mother come alive. But for Nora, it was more than kindness, it was memory. As she signed, she remembered Eli, the little boy who used to tug at her sleeve for attention, who had passed away 2 years earlier after a long illness. Her hands moved with both skill and sorrow, expressing words her voice couldn't carry anymore. It was as if, through Margaret, she was speaking to her brother again, one last conversation that the universe had given her by chance. After the meal, Margaret insisted on meeting her personally. Adrian watched as his mother clasped Nora's hands tightly, tears glistening in her eyes. She signed, "You made me feel seen. You reminded me I'm not alone." Nora's lips trembled as she signed back, "You reminded me that love never disappears." The quiet beauty of that exchange made the air around them almost sacred. Later, Adrian called Nora aside. She braced herself for criticism, maybe even reprimand. After all, she had gone beyond her duties. But instead, Adrian's voice was different, softer, uncertain. He told her how his mother had felt isolated for years, even in her own home, and how no one had ever cared enough to communicate with her this way. Then, in a rare moment of vulnerability, he confessed that his mother had taught him the importance of empathy, something he had lost somewhere between boardrooms and business wars. Nora's simple act had reminded him what truly mattered. He asked Nora about her life, and when she mentioned her brother, he understood the depth behind her gestures. Without saying much, Adrian arranged for the hotel to sponsor free sign language training for all its staff, in memory of Eli, though Nora never asked for it. He also offered her a full scholarship to pursue special education, telling her the world needed people like her, people who could bridge silence with compassion. Word of what happened that afternoon spread far beyond the hotel. Guests who witnessed it shared the story online, and soon it became a symbol of quiet humanity, how one shy waitress had done something no wealth or power could buy. She had spoken to a heart without needing words. Margaret often returned to the hotel after that, always asking for Nora, and their friendship became a living testament that kindness, in its purest form, doesn't need sound to be heard. Weeks later, as Nora stood by the window during her break, watching the sun filter through the city skyline, she thought of Eli and whispered a silent thank you. Sometimes, the world tested her with loneliness, but moments like this reminded her that love always finds a way to return, often through strangers who need it just as much as you do.